Thompson.
You're both with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University.
And this is Fahrenheit 140.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. How are you
Long
doing
time
today?
no see. Welcome, welcome.
Yeah, gosh, time flies when you're busy as holy heck. And then you lose your executive assistant like I did. So I'm sort of like, I have no idea where I'm supposed to be when and what I'm supposed to be doing, but I just kind of show up.
Well, in the meantime, you literally went to the other side of the world, right?
I did. And I wanted to focus my kind of opening bit on our trip to Iceland. It was kind of our big coming out of the pandemic trip. My wife and I, our favorite band is Icelandic, and it's a group called Goose Goose. It's Gus. They're named Goose Goose. That's how you say it, Goose Goose. And they're named after a Fassbinder film where a German waitress is mispronouncing couscous. Would you like some couscous? Would you like some couscous? So, anyways, this band they've been around a while because we're old, and they were having their 25th anniversary show. And of course, it got delayed because of the pandemic, and then finally it happened. Just so happened to happen over our spring break at Texas State University in Reykjavik, and so we were able to go over there. And one of the things that I was, of course, excited to go see this band, and they played like 4 total shows. We saw them 2 shows. It was worth it. And but also on my bucket list, besides Goose Goose Show 1, Goose Goose Show 2, was to go visit the geothermal plant that provides power to Reykjavik. But also see if I could take a peek at the Climeworks CO2 atmospheric harvester demonstration plant that also exists there. And I've mentioned this in a previous show.
Just the typical things people do on vacation, right?
And my wife, Wendy, she's an engineer that works on power plants. So I mean, she's all in. So she's just like, oh yeah, And we tried to see this power plant on a previous trip, and the tour bus rolled in, and the place was locked up.
Oh no.
So it was a challenge though, because the weather was awful in Iceland while we were there, just super snowy and stuff, and we're like kind of looking at different options. They don't have Uber or anything like that. It's about 30 kilometers west of town, and finally I'm just like, let's just splurge and day rent a 4-wheel drive, and we needed it. We needed 4-wheel drive to get out there to it, at least in the morning, because it was pretty slushy and snowy. But it was really worth it. And unfortunately, the plant was open. And one cool thing was they have a big visitor center, and the plant is all operated remotely. So nobody is on site operating the plant. It's all done from Reykjavik. And they just had 2 people there to operate kind of the information center. That's a major part of the plant. And because the weather is so awful over the winter, that's where they put their geologists during the winter. So we got to visit with a couple of their geologists, which was kind of
cool.
Awesome. So one of the things I learned is, of course, we talk about climate change and going to green sources of power, and geothermal is one of those, and I didn't realize this, although it's kind of one of those things where in retrospect you're like, duh, but I didn't realize this, but they have when you produce water for geothermal power, at least in Iceland, the water that comes up is it's got a lot of CO2 in it, so it's like Topo Chico, really warm Topo Chico.
Oh wow.
Coming up out of the subsurface, and so it emits a lot of CO2 that they then have to capture, and so they capture the CO2 and then deep well inject it.
Oh wow.
And so they've been doing that there, which was also the spark for Climeworks kind of doing their atmospheric CO2 harvester, because it was like it was already injection wells there to inject CO2 laden water back into the subsurface with the basalts, and then it turns into limestone. So they had a whole display about kind of what they're doing, both at the plant and with Climeworks. And it was also cool talking to the geologists, because I'm like, well, doesn't that affect the permeability of the rock? Because when when you're pushing the CO2 in the subsurface, there's some chemical reactions where it's basically creating limestone. And you're talking fractured rock, and so that limestone's blocking up the fractures. And he said that, yeah, that's true. And those injection wells tend to have a lifespan of about 2 years, which is not great for a well, but that's what they're doing out there. The Climeworks facility, it's kind of a good thing I can't read Icelandic really well, because I don't think I was supposed to go back there. But I did anyways. My wife's like, "What's that red sign mean?" I said, "I don't know. I can't read it." We just drove back in there. It was, we didn't get a tour. I was afraid of getting shot, but we drove right up to it, and I got some pictures of it. And again, the weather was pretty miserable, but it was kind of cool. It just looked like the pictures that you've seen out in the press if you've looked them up. But again, that's one of the things that folks are looking at to decrease carbon content of the atmosphere, is just harvest it straight out of the atmosphere, and then dispose of that some way, shape, or form. And then I don't know if you want me to tell you my third thing.
Oh yeah.
The third thing I learned.
This is already your third thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Is the first one was geothermal. Second was Climeworks, and then the third is I'm working on this book on groundwater sustainability, and
it's going to be amazing.
It's going to be amazing. Yeah, I gave it a 50-50 chance they would take it, because I go a little goofball in the book, but they said they were going to accept it, and they really wanted me to add some more examples from around the planet. And so I'm just like, and I have a month to do this, and one of those weeks of the month I was in Iceland, and so I'm like, I'm going to write about groundwater in Iceland. Kind of was doing some research on groundwater in Iceland, and I came across a paper about kind of climate change impacts on surface water resources in Iceland. And one of the things they mentioned just kind of blew my mind, which was that as the glaciers melt, there's concerns about, once the glaciers are gone, then you don't get as much melt. And a lot of power in Iceland comes from hydropower, but a lot of that power goes towards smelting aluminum. It's mostly for industrial purposes. But the other thing that happens when a glacier melts, at least actually it doesn't matter where it melts, but it happens in Iceland too, is you get something called isostatic release of the crust. Yeah, it sounds exciting. Isostatic release. So what happens is that as the glacier melts, you lose weight on the earth. And when you lose that weight on the earth, the ground actually rises in response. So if you have a Tempur-Pedic bed, it's flat, and then you kind of lay down in it, and at least for me, my big butt kind of really dents that mattress in, and then then I wake up in the morning, I get out, and then it's just kind of slowly, creepily comes back into, well, that's kind of how isostatic release works. And so in Iceland, because they're on a mid-Atlantic ridge and there's all this volcanic activity, which is why it's so geothermal, it's going to allow more magma to move into kind of volcanic chambers and stuff. And so they're predicting more volcanic eruptions in Iceland due to the glaciers melting.
Wow.
And then that relates to, they have some crazy deals where they have a glacier sitting in a volcano, in active volcanoes. And the warmth of the volcano will melt the glacier, kind of fill up the volcanic crater, and then at some point the glacier will go buoyant. And when it goes buoyant, the water will start squirting out the sides. But then as the water squirts out the sides, the glacier is no longer buoyant, and so it slams down and has these catastrophic floods. And so this paper was kind of talking about this isostatic rebound, with respect to surface water, impacts on surface water. And so maybe my small contribution to science with my little write-up is like, that affects the groundwater too.
Oh, nice.
But anyway, it's pretty crazy. And then I had some friends send me over the last day some articles about a city called Hoffen, which is it's on the coast, just down from the glaciers. And they're dealing, because of this isostatic rebound from the glaciers melting, whereas most parts of the world are going to see sea level rise, like Texas is going to see sea level rise along the coast. They're dealing with sea levels falling because the ground is rising from this isostatic.
Wow.
So their bay is getting shallower and shallower every year, and it's starting to cause some problems with them.
Wow.
So anyways, just kind of, Iceland's just cool that way. There's just all kinds of crazy
What did you find about the consciousness there? Did you have any observations about kind of how they think about? Do they think about climate change? Do they talk about it?
I didn't see much about that there, actually. I mean, I didn't see, and I also wasn't like, hey, baby, what do you think about climate change? I wasn't like going to the bars and chatting up people about climate change. There's, like on the groundwater side, there is kind of a climate change impact on, they're seeing spring come sooner, and they're seeing kind of more E. coli in their water that they think is related to kind of warming episodes. That's kind of activating stuff in the soil that's then kind of getting into the groundwater systems. There's, I've read articles in the past, there's some opportunistic folks that are kind of thinking that, if as the Northwest Passage opens up, they would like to take advantage of that in terms of like building a port on the northern side of the island and hope to make money. But there are concerns about the effects on the hydropower, and more recently, this thing about the crust rebounding and affecting the bays and causing sea level retreat is a concern, because a lot of villages earn their income from fishing. And so
would that impact the injection you were talking about too, potentially, some of the stability of those operations?
Probably not. It's possible, but probably not. It's a pretty slow process, but they're seeing it happening.
Yeah. Right. Wow, a good trip.
So I didn't really read anything. I just kind of I experienced it.
Well, we're all really experiencing it, Robert, aren't we? Every day.
True.
Well,
what did you learn, Carrie?
Well, I picked a few things to talk about, but I know we need to save a little extra time for our guest this week.
Oh, yes. So, that's right. Who's our guest?
Our guest. You know who our guest is.
Do I?
We are inviting our visiting scholar, Nick Tarasewicz, to come talk with us today. He's been working with us for the last, 8 months, something like that.
Yeah.
And kind of a budding expert and leader in this realm we're pretty proud of. So just talk to him here in a little bit.
Yeah, very articulate, very smart about this stuff, and we're going to miss him.
We're going to miss him desperately.
Yes.
One of the things Nick did for us, invite all of our many listeners, to go check out our blog post about the IPCC reports that have just come out, and thought we should just talk a few minutes about the highlights there. Maybe for the outro this time, Robert, you could play Elvis's Now or Never, because I feel like that's our new anthem for 2022. It's Now or Never. That was kind of what the conclusions were on this last report from the IPCC. They have a third working group that released a report, and this was really about kind of what's realistic about where we are and our ability to respond to what we know. And there was a little bit of bleakness to it, and that I'm just going to share a couple quotes here. We really basically have 3 years to turn the boat around, and 3 years. So if you have a senior in high school, before they graduate college, we have to have completely changed course on the way we do everything, and it's a pretty tall order. So it's a little, yeah.
And that's for not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Well, so even if, like, here's this, even if all the policies to cut carbon that are in place by the end of 2020, so even if we implemented everything in the Paris Accord, it's saying that the world will still warm by 3.2 C this century. So what I understand is that 1.5 is not technically impossible, but it's realistically impossible at this point.
I would agree with that, yeah.
And that everyone's saying we'll be lucky to get to stop at 2. This is saying the way we're going, we'll be lucky to stop at 3. And so that just keeps, we just keep pushing that needle over with every minute we wait. So this was really a call to arms and saying, like, we really have to act now and act dramatically. So, but the other part was they did say it's still possible. It can be done. We can do it. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about the reports that came out. There was also in our break here, the second report was also released, which was really a little bit more about the vulnerabilities and.
Mm-hmm. If you go look at the report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that report that Carrie's referring to, it is pretty much just the facts, ma'am, type of report, and analyzing, where we're going now, as Carrie mentioned, what we would have to do to achieve certain goals. Carrie hears me, and Nick also. My soapbox is about scientists staying scientists and being careful about entering the policy realm. And so the report, my impression of the report was it was very scientific, but the press release was very advocacy, and that actually made me sad because there are, for example, I think. There's in the Republican Party national platform, it talks about the IPC as a political body. It's interesting. It's not the platform isn't anti-climate change. It isn't that it isn't happening. In fact, it's encouraging carbon capture and sequestration, kind of like what we heard from Dr. Havorka at an earlier show. But it doesn't believe the IPCC is policy neutral, and I can kind of agree with them. It's like the reports are great, but somebody dropped the ball on being careful about their press releases.
Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, it is complicated. My understanding is that they produce a policymaker's document, right? So that the idea is that it's science meant to inform policy, because policy is what's going to make this pivot for us, right? Science doesn't make the pivot for our behavior. It just tells folks how they could pivot. And then I think what I understand is that the process for approving this report actually does become somewhat political, and that the different governments sit down and they go line by line and approve each line. Like it's a very extensive process, and it does have some social science and social valuation in it. Like, I understand that this report talked about the role of colonialism, for example. So there are these social aspects to the report that are not hard physical science, right? That we would maybe think about, because they're looking at the entire dynamic and saying, here's what's happening, here's why it's happening. And then if we start to think about how we course correct, they start talking about lifestyle changes. They start talking about, the role of policy and the role of human behavior. And so at some point that does get fuzzy, I think.
Yeah, well, and all that stuff is okay, and it just depends how you talk about it. In my opinion, it's like, it's like rather than showing up and saying this is what you have to do, instead you're showing up and you qualify, where it's like, if you want to prevent warming from going over 1.5, then here are some options. You're going to need to consider doing these things, or a combination of things. And you choose. We've done the analysis, and I think it's also appropriate to say, if you miss 1.5 degrees C, here's what could happen, between this and the next jump. So, on balance, IPCC does a good job. I think the criticisms of them are a little overly harsh, but it did make me sad inside when I read the press release, because I was just like, oh my gosh, how did this get passed? It wasn't carefully reviewed, in my opinion, because it did make some very strong policy statements of, the world needs to do blah 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 now. Otherwise, and to me, I'm just like, no, that's not the role of scientists, even political scientists or policy analysts. The role is, here's the situation, here's what we know, don't know, here are some policy options, and you decide what you're willing to live with and go forward. And this is a big thing to me, because it's like the dialogue. I feel like there's two cultures that don't understand each other. Scientists don't understand the politicians and the policymakers, and the policymakers don't understand the scientists. And the scientists are like, well, I do my thing, and it goes through peer review and all this stuff, so it stands on its own. And so if I get over here and make a policy statement, it doesn't affect the work that I've done. In a policymaker's eyes, you've just expressed an inherent bias, which throws everything you've done into question.
There's also, I think, the pressure on them to, we talk about this almost every show, is this tension between optimism and realism or pessimism. And I do feel like there's pressure on the IPCC to put something forward that gives an optimistic spin on kind of what our options are, even though that window is getting smaller and smaller. I feel like they end up generating, policy ideas that are meant to empower, but it does come off as advocacy, I think, in a lot of ways. And I see what you're saying.
Well, and that's a good point too, because for in certain quarters, just doing work on climate change is an expression of bias, those people, I don't want to say they're hopeless, but probably don't have to worry about those folks. But I think the folks that are maybe then you've got the folks that are completely on board that something has to be done, and believe what the scientists are saying, and then you've got this gray area, and I think when you're in the gray area, because I'm a skeptic, scientists are skeptical of almost everything. We can be pretty miserable people to hang out with. Ask my wife, because I question everything, and that kind of gets lost, I think, on the policymakers. But on the scientist side, they don't understand that if you're a policymaker or a politician, and you're just interacting with people with biases, trying to work you over to do something, and not necessarily for the benefit of society, so they're trained to look for the bias. And so when they see it, it's like, hey, I'm doing this science, but then I'm also advocating for, you to no longer eat hamburgers. You shouldn't eat hamburgers anymore. It's like, okay.
But the challenge is, and what they did for decades is put raw science out, and no one knew what they were talking about, and no one knew how it really related to real life choices. And so I do think it's positive that there's an intent to think, how can we explain what the science means, and and how these numbers can be affected and how meaningful these numbers are. But
Oh,
I hear
I,
you're right on. You're right on.
I agree 100%. I mean, but it's like the scientist, like if it was me, it'd be like, okay, here's a number of things you can do to stay
Right.
under 1.5. You could choose to not eat meat anymore. That's that. You could choose to make all the cars electric. You could choose to go to nuclear power. You could choose to go to all renewables. And so those are options, which is a lot different than me showing up saying, y'all need to give up your Big Macs. Otherwise, we're going to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
So to me, and the thing is also, it's like there are people advocating to not eat the hamburgers. It's like, so a scientist doesn't need to get into that space.
Right.
My opinion. I know it's unpopular with some folks, but I don't think people realize that in the policy world, when you express that bias, it cancels out your science. And so that's, in my opinion, that's why there is a big perception of bias from the scientific side. There's I can't remember what it is. There's a group now that's like scientists protesting against climate change and stuff. And I was just kind of checking out that Twitter feed, and part of it was you don't eat hamburgers anymore, and give up all these things. And I'm just like, this is, they feel like they're doing something helpful. To me, it's like the worst possible thing to be doing. Because it's the people that need to be convinced at this point. It needs a more delicate touch, and you need to be careful. It's like, stay in your lane. There's already people like PETA, getting after people about their hamburgers, and so you don't need climate scientists doing that. But anyways. I could talk an hour about this, Carrie, but
no, you can't.
Sorry.
Because we have to leave time for Nick.
Yes.
But, so let's blaze on through. We don't have to talk long about this next one, but I did it as a favor to you because it's called Climatologist Says the Future Mega-Drought Could Harm Lake Travis Area. And you know who the climatologist is, right?
Yeah, John Nielsen Gammon, I'm sure.
Yes. Your man crush says that he is predicting that a long-term drought known as a mega-drought could be in Texas's future. And just kind of pointing out that, we are in the middle of a drought, and this article, which we'll have the link for on our website, really kind of goes into more detail about the difference between extended drought, which we're used to here in Texas, and a mega drought, and the implications of a mega drought on top of the kind of population growth we've experienced here. And the way you enjoy this article, Robert, because they actually also talk about the implications of the Texas water planning system and the regional water plans. And because of the way we've set up the water planning, we don't do a great job of thinking about what's happening upstream, right? Like, so the water plan for this region kind of starts at where we collect the water for Austin, for those of you that aren't from this region, and it goes down to the coast. But one of the things they talk about, the implications of drought, and the implications of water wrangling and moving water around the state, is that there's a lot less water coming into the system. And so it's a nicely done article kind of talking about some of the more intricate concerns that we need to be considering when we think about water supplies for the future. And so I would recommend local folks tune into this article.
And I feel like there is a mega drought now going on in the American Southwest.
Right.
At the very least, that extends into Colorado and New Mexico. And I kind of think it also extends, the fringes of it extend into Texas, into West Texas. John Nielsen Gammon, and he probably knows more about this than I do, would disagree with me because I've asked him about it. But I feel like that the edges of that touch touch the hill country and the catchment to the Highland Lakes.
That makes sense.
Maybe
yeah.
at some point I'd like to take a look at that. John Nielsen Gammon's just kind of pointing to the drought monitor and all that stuff, but you look at those West Texas reservoirs and you look at how the Highland Lake system's just responding differently now than it used to. I feel like that it's either part of that mega-drought or it's a new normal, and it could be a climate change thing. And so
And
there's some debate going on
about
about the American Southwest drought. There's a debate about that as well. Is that a drought? Because if it's a new normal, it's not a drought. That's the new normal.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see. But that's been raging out there for 22 years now.
Gosh. Well, last headline before we go to the good news. Just kind of pointing out, there's been some press this month about methane emissions, and if y'all recall.
Speaking of methane emissions.
Yeah, the dog just chimed in on that one.
That was beautiful.
That was beautiful, yes. She's such a lady.
What's your dog's name?
Ruby.
Ruby. Okay.
Yeah. So just NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, put out a report this year that global methane has unfortunately soared to a new record, which it had a new record last year. And for those of you who have forgotten our episode during the break about methane, one of the interesting things that came out of the first IPCC report this year was the role that methane plays, and the good news being that it's the climate is very responsive to the reduction of methane, and so if we're going to do anything right now, it's reduce methane, and unfortunately, it's just soaring. It's just soaring, and a lot of the source is from leaking natural gas and oil wells that are not properly capped, and or transport lines that aren't properly sealed and have leaks. And we had a headline this week here in Texas about a pipeline run by a company called Energy Transfer, and the leak in that pipeline alone is equal to the emissions of 16,000 cars, it says. And so just to give you a bit of a perspective, just wanted to point it out because it's such a bummer. And it's really something we could do different. It would be an easy fix. I mean, I'm not saying I know how to fix it, but it seems like an easy fix.
Yeah, methane is, what is it? I think it's 25 times more potent than CO2. It's the bad news. The good news is that it has a much lower residence time than CO2. So it has a residence time in the atmosphere of 9 years.
There's a quote in here that's cool about carbon. So just kind of to orient everyone, carbon's the most, that's the thing we're most worried about. But like Robert said, methane's a lot more responsive. And this quote here about carbon was interesting. About 40% of the Ford Model T emissions from 1911 are still in the air today.
Holy cow. So
that just gives you a sense of how long it takes for us to process and digest all that carbon we're emitting. It's a little depressing.
That's an awesome stat.
Crazy.
Well, welcome back, and we have our guest with us, Nicolas, aka Nick Tarasewicz. And he has been working with us at the Meadows Center, assisting us with our climate program, and quite frankly has done an amazing job. He is going off, as he should, to go advance his education, to go work on a Ph.D., and we'll be asking him about that coming up. But it says something about somebody that you work with when you think about them leaving, and you start thinking like maybe you're going to start crying like a baby and going into a fetal position, because Nick has been absolutely wonderful on really on so many levels as a person, is amazingly smart. He is a youngster, but I go to him for information on climate change and talking things out, and I've always come away, amazed at his knowledge base as well as the way he thinks about things. And he's also incredibly competent in the work that he does, and amazingly helpful. Carrie, you want to say anything?
All of that and more. I start every morning with my countdown. When's Nick leaving?
I keep forgetting the date because it's too traumatic.
It's too upsetting. Yeah, I know.
I always ask him, like, when are you leaving? No. So we're definitely going to miss Nick. But we wanted to invite him on the show because he is very articulate, and he's a youngster. Of course, I'm at the age now. Anybody under 45 is a youngster. But
you mean 48, right?
48, yeah, 48 is a youngster. And although one person can't represent an entire generation, it is interesting to me to, in interacting with Nick, kind of get the perspective on his generation. So we'll talk a bit about that through the interview. First up, Nick, just wanted you to tell us a bit about your background and your interest and what got you into climate.
Of course. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Carrie, both for inviting me onto the podcast and just letting me be a part of this conversation. It's always an enjoyable time when I get to talk climate. And all of the nice things you said have me just blushing on the side of the screen and smiling. But
he is red.
Yeah, much appreciated, though. In terms of my background, I hail from a small town deep in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, or the San Juan Mountains to be precise, called Lake City. And I grew up in a tiny town in a really small class size. I believe there were around 6 or 7 people in my grade level total. And so
which is amazing. Yeah.
So it was, created a really tight knit community, and it's a small town that historically was a mining settlement, but is now transitioned into outdoor based kind of tourism, and is just a nice sleepy little mountain town, really cozy. But it is the picture perfect definition of growing up in nature, surrounded by nature. There are 5 14ers if anyone's into hiking in the area. And so, those were always accessible to me. My parents used to own an outdoor store and fly shop in the area. So I literally grew up working there and being a part of that kind of journey. And as a part of this store, we did guided tours and outdoor trips and taught kind of, leave no trace, catch and release fishing, all of these kinds of ways to interact and recreate with the outdoors. And so being exposed to that was...
So I got a quick question. Is a 14er, is that like how many beers it takes to do the whole trail? What's a 14er?
Yeah, roughly how many you need after you finish it. But,
is that like miles or?
It is. A 14er refers to a mountain that is over 14,000 feet tall.
Okay. Wow.
And that's the amount of elevation gain you kind of do. So it's
wow.
It's kind of like Enchanted Rock, Robert, It's similar.
Where you also need 14 beers to get to the top and back.
Exactly. They're kind of the peaks that you start hiking them around 4 or 5 a.m. So you're off the mountain by 1. That's the kind of goal you set, because up that high, that's when the afternoon Colorado weather might set in, and you don't want to be up there when lightning's striking. Or there was a time when my dad took me on Uncompahgre Peak when I was younger, and it was blowing wind like crazy, and my little body we couldn't summit it because the wind was just too strong for me. Wow. So we had to turn back around.
And there's not a lot of oxygen up at that level.
No, but it's great because whenever I would go visit friends or go out of state, I'm coming down from an elevation. And so in terms of doing physical activities and outdoor stuff, it's an advantage on some levels to just be used to that level. But when a lot of people come up to visit, we have people who, are in great physical condition, are, marathon runners, but if they don't take it easy and give themselves some time to adjust, even just a day, they'll be flat on their butt, which is
Wow.
always interesting. But growing up in this environment made me, generated a huge passion and appreciation for the outdoors. And I've always been a big reader as well. I enjoy learning, and I got to see the forests and the mountains that I love, that I grew up in, slowly lose health as the years went by. Warmer winter conditions made it so that the pine bark beetles didn't die off, and weren't the population was not controlled in the wintertime. And so I got to witness over the years this gradual and then very aggressive transition between bright green, vibrant, healthy ecosystems to just miles and miles of trees as far as the eye can see, of just dead tree. And that obviously generates a lot of fire concerns. And, as a young child growing up, it made me just ask questions about, why is this happening? And okay, so this is normal. This is an expected part of a natural and healthy ecosystem, but what is wrong with it to this extent, and why? And so those questions kind of lead you to the climate, and it progresses from there. So that kind of interest followed me to my college years. I went to the University of Denver, up in Denver, Colorado, which, again, from a small town to a big town, was quite the transition for me. But it was still an enjoyable and educative time. And I entered college not really knowing what I wanted to do, because I had skill sets in different areas. I enjoyed math because of the critical thinking and problem solving nature of it, but I wasn't entirely sure that was the direction I wanted to go in.
And
I remember,
aren't you also a first generation college student in your family?
I am not. I'm
Okay.
not. No. Both my parents are college educated, but I will be a first generation Ph.D. if that is successful. So fingers crossed there. Following that, I was sitting in a introductory geography class in college, and it was one of those things where, just based off of my high school education, I wasn't entirely sure. Okay, maps, and sort of what was geography, and I didn't have really a great understanding of it. And taking a course at the college level, it was a very eye-opening experience. Just the first week sitting down and talking about how everything is related. This idea of the study of Earth as home. That is a concept that expands and extends many different fields. And as someone who has interests and enjoyed studying chemistry, biology, physics, computers, sociology, all of these different aspects are combined together into this one field, with this added context of humans and how we are a part of and coexist with the environment. And so that was a very appealing thing. Love at first sight, as they say. And the rest is history from there, really. After undergrad, it was the kind of thing to where I had been intending to pursue a master's degree from there, but I wasn't very certain on where or in what specifically. But there was a situation that arose to where I was made aware of a great program that was a partnership between University of Denver and a university in Sweden called Lund University. It's in the south of Sweden, about an hour away from Malmo and near Copenhagen in Denmark. And the program essentially amounted to what we would think of like a 5 years master's, so like a 3+2 program in that sense, to where if you happen to finish your undergraduate credits early, you begin on your master degree, graduate level credits before you officially graduate with your undergrad. And that sort of approach seemed to fit, because without intending to, I happened to have been on track to fit into that program and slot into it. So I joined up, and my last year of my undergraduate time was spent moving to Sweden and starting my master's degree there, and finishing those 2 years living in a foreign country, getting to experience a new culture, different education system, and really being exposed to some top quality climate education, if I do say so, because the university in Sweden is ran in a way to where instead of just having one instructor or two instructors for a single course, you have 5, 6, or 7 instructors per course, because professors only teach what they have experience and research expertise in, and they kind of cycle through with different projects. And so that gets you a large amount of exposure to a wide variety of experts in their field. And it was a wonderful opportunity to get to do some field work in the Arctic, design, and run, for any of the listeners who understand what or know about flux towers and eddy covariance measurement systems. That's kind of where I fell in love with those processes. And it was a very challenging but rewarding time. And I walked away from that with a master's degree in physical geography and ecosystem science. And the next thing I knew, I was at the Meadows Center. So,
Yeah, speaking of experiencing a different culture, you came to Texas.
yeah, absolutely. Which is almost entertaining on some levels, because a huge amount of the people who come and visit Lake City growing up in the outdoor store are from Texas and Oklahoma, and our neighbors. And so I was familiar tangentially with kind of the culture, and was friends with many people from the state, but I never had gotten an opportunity to visit long term and live here. So this past year has been amazing on that sense, and getting to immerse myself in the Texas Hill Country and just see another new environment. It's been wonderful.
Let's hear it. What do you think? What's your review of Texas when you go?
What's my review of Texas?
It's your next stop. What are you going to tell people about us? I mean, I want to hear it.
It's wonderful.
There was a lot of uncomfortable readjusting in the chair there.
Oh, being called out now. No, it's one of those things where I have an obvious bias, right? Because for me, the mountains will always be home, and
Sure.
Texas just does not have those kinds of mountains. But the hill country itself is gorgeous, and I fully admit that I have not gotten a chance to explore the rest of the state at all. So I'm approaching this from a very narrow perspective. But that said, I've enjoyed experiencing the hill country and just going on runs and walks in a new environment. Although it's very humid and very hot here. It's in April, and we've already experienced some 90-degree days, and my poor weak little Colorado soul can't handle those kinds of temperatures this soon.
I was about to say, you've been here mostly in the winter and you think it's really hot, huh?
I do. That just goes to show. Keep in mind, I moved from Colorado to Sweden, which also has pretty intense cold winters. So this has been a complete opposite for me on that sense. So
true enough, yeah.
And then where are you going next? You're leaving
us. Where am I going
next? In May?
Sadly, I am departing, but I will be going back to Colorado. The offer is appreciated, but like I said, the mountains call me, and I'll be going to the University of Boulder up in Boulder, Colorado.
That's rough.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. It's a huge sacrifice, but someone has to make it, right? But over this past summer, I got in contact with the man who's eventually has now become my Ph.D. supervisor, and the project I'm working on is taking a look in the Front Range Mountains, looking at how do we measure and map this concept known as refugia, which is a mouthful of a term, but essentially boils down to just being what environments in an ecosystem are resilient to the changes in climate that we are currently facing and we will continue to face in the future. And in the Colorado mountains, this is particularly relevant because in addition to all the ecosystem services forests normally provide, they also represent a huge contribution to the water system and the amount of water that is retained and put into systems and streams that eventually flow down and even come back all the way here to Texas. So it's a really important environment to understand how it will be affected in the future. And this idea that, yes, some portions and pockets will be impacted more so or less so than others, But what we define as, quote, resilient is also dependent on what we as people, as humans, value as well from our environment. And so trying to integrate conducting convergent research, trying to integrate the physical geography, the physical science side, and the human side. So trying to bring those two components together and create this way to approach a problem that really affects all of us. And these kinds of techniques and this perspective is nothing new. It's been applied already throughout the country and others. But from my perspective, I'm technically what's coined as a physical geographer. So I deal with more of the hard science, the biogeochemical cycling. I'm focused on studying forests and mountain ecosystems and how trees process, absorb, and release carbon dioxide and water and other types of biogeochemical tracers. And all of those flow into one another. And so I'm someone who really appreciates and is involved in the measurements of that. And so that's kind of the component I'll be focusing on, and getting to join this really, really great team and this wonderful project that has sufficient funding. So as a perpetual student at this point, it is always a nice thing to have that in mind.
And it's poetic, because you mentioned when you were a child being concerned about what was happening to the forest. So it's cool that you're looping back to studying the forest, in particular with respect to climate change impacts. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's a fulfillment of a childhood dream that I didn't even realize I had when I was a child.
The awkward silence is like me creating space for Carrie to ask a question. So
no pressure.
So I'm not like taking all the questions.
No, I was kind of gonna wait till we move to the next topic.
Oh, okay. We're ready to move to the next topic. I need like a horn or something.
I could just continue, just rambling on about my passion for trees and stuff, but
yeah.
Well, let's move to the next topic. As I mentioned in the introduction, you're young, you're still in college, you're starting your career. You are an old Gen Zer, I guess. You're just at that flip from millennial to Gen Z. And for you boomers out there, all the youngsters are not millennials. There's folks that were born in I think 97 going forward are now considered Gen Z. And in fact, we've got Gen Alpha now as well. Let me bring that up. Yeah, so Gen Z, if you're born between 97 and 2012. And so now we've got Gen Alpha, which blows my mind. The class I'm teaching, a lot of those students were not born in the 1900s. So they were born in 2000 or later. So it's a little crazy being an old dude. Not to put the weight of your generation on your shoulders with a sample of one, but I'm wondering if your observations of your generation and in your own experience, what are you and your peers kind of thinking about what's happening with climate, and what's being done, what's not being done?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, I will condition and caveat everything I'm about to say, as I do not speak for my entire generation. I myself was born in 97, so I am the cutoff point between growing up with an iPhone in my hand and not actually experiencing or seeing one until I was in middle school. So that I think offers some interesting perspective as well. And I think growing up in a small town without that kind of what we now consider everyday access to the internet and technology, it was an interesting thing to be a part of the transition, and offers a unique kind of contrast, because like you're talking about, you're teaching people who've, grown up with, these kinds of technologies in front of them, which is a huge benefit to some extents and, drawbacks to others. But keeping myself back on topic and not trying to deviate from the question at hand, I would say for someone who is pursuing life as an academic and as a researcher, and who is obviously heavily invested in climate change, I'm someone who, the people I associate with share for the most part similar perspectives that I do. But in general, what I tend to see in my age range, in my generation, is a remarkable combination of severe pessimism and melancholy, coupled with astounding levels of motivation and drive. There's an energy to my generation that is inspirational on some levels, while in the face of, climate change is often referred to as the most pressing, matter of conflict that is facing humans thus far. And even if that is an exceedingly strong statement, I don't disagree with it to many extents when you look at the impacts that we're currently experiencing and the ones that, the continued worsening in light of the severe lack of meaningful action that's thus far been taken. It's easy to feel powerless. And I remember many phone calls to my parents during my master's in Sweden, far away from home, living across the seas, just in a very melancholy mood about learning the hard facts, I guess you could say, about how the environment and ecosystem interacts and feedbacks with human activity, and the really just, the more depressing characteristics of what is currently occurring, and the scale. It's really the scale that feels severely overwhelming, because how can any single person, in the light of a entirely global problem, feel like they have any power to do anything about it? But at the same time, we all recognize that none of us are actually alone in this feeling. And that's what gives us the power. That's what gives us the motivation, because we are in this together. And there are things that can and are being done about it. So it's trying to keep realism with optimism at the same time. At least that's what I strive for, especially what continues to motivate me to continue pursuing and throwing me back into the ring, I guess. And for me and people I've talked to in my age group, it's one of those issues to where we recognize, and I think many of us recognize, even those not in our own generation, that the problems facing us are ones that a single person cannot ever hope to solve themselves. I believe the actual statistic in terms of the carbon impact of a single human being is 0.000000008 or 9 zeros. The exact number of zeros isn't immediately coming to mind. 3%. So that is a huge order of magnitude of one human's carbon footprint compared to a planet. But at the same time, we require a huge amount of policy and large-scale top-down changes in order to make the most meaningful impacts in these systems, because all those little percentages do add up and they do matter. And it's the sort of thing to where, for me, I'm motivated by continuing to learn and understand more about the planet. And I think one of the most important aspects in all of these kinds of conversations is the topic of education, which feedbacks into this podcast's very existence, what I've been working on with the Meadows Center, and what drives me with with education in the science and the research that I'm pursuing. Because while I'm a physical geographer and I'm passionate about, measurements and data and running models and all of these things, I think being able to convey this knowledge is what is the most important part of all of this. Because we touched upon this earlier, really understood what an actual geography class was until I reached college. And that's not saying anything against my previous education. I was very lucky to attend wonderful schools that really fostered the drive in their students to learn and pursue and follow what they were, what calls them. But I also remember only having a few weeks of a unit on Earth systems and ecosystems and biology. And I remember geology only really covered, types of rocks and minerals and how they interact. And to some levels, the more advanced stuff, it has its time and its place, and covering things to that kind of magnitude, often a university environment is very suited to that. But at the same time, a lot of these things can easily be integrated into education earlier on. Things like just understanding the greenhouse effect beyond it's the warm blanket that keeps us alive would be immensely helpful in just an innate understanding of what is occurring to our planet. Same things for kind of talking about humans not as separated from the environment, but as a part of it. We are a part of nature. We exist within these natural systems, not as some tangential part away from it. And those kinds of understandings are what is vital to begin to create awareness and this deep understanding of what is going on. And that's what leads to deep change as well. And not even those who are my age or school age, but people who've been long out of school, making that information accessible without bias and making it widespread enough is, in my opinion, really important. Obviously, the policy actions are relevant as well, and I'm not trying to take away from it in the slightest. But in order to try to motivate action in light of the scale and scope of what needs to be done, people have to be aware and they have to feel like they do have power in it. And it's easy to, in some sense, because they do. One of the most important things anyone can actually do for climate is to vote for policies and policymakers who support climate action and have viable, realistic plans in place. But we don't get to vote every day either. However, we do buy something every day. And those kinds of ideas of understanding that your purchasing power, your choices that you make into your day-to-day life seem minor, but they add up. The things you buy and the actions you do help convey messages to those who we elect to represent us about what we care about and what we're willing to stand up for. And 40% of all food purchased by Americans is wasted, and that goes directly as as excess carbon dioxide, and is a huge waste in terms of, if you consider the amount of CO2 and greenhouse gases involved in agriculture production. And being more cognizant in those actions and bringing those kinds of numbers down do actually have a meaningful and tangential impact. Same thing as trying to limit flying, or talking to electrical and utility companies to switch your bill over to renewable sources. All of those things actually have meaningful impact, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I feel like I definitely rambled on that, but I hope somewhere in there was an answer to your question.
Yeah, I guess I did want to ask you, do you think, I mean, and I know the sample set's biased here. We got Nick deep in this, in the studies you're in. I'm sure the people are a little more savvy on these issues, but do you have a sense that climate literacy is something that your generation has, that they got a basic level of understanding of the urgency around climate change?
It's definitely improved, and I definitely, in the conversations I've had, note a higher level of understanding than even I had when I was growing up, which is wonderful and should continue. I think it can always obviously be improved. I'm heavily biased on that as well, but I do believe that the general level has gone up, and education systems have been transitioning and switching over into greater levels of climate literacy. But it's also...
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, do you sense that like folks feel empowered politically? They feel like voting actually has an outcome, or do you see people disengaging from the political remedies?
That's a great question, and I would say, like all things, it's nuanced and there's context, and the answer is always somewhere in the middle. But some people I talk to feel very empowered by the fact that they get to engage and vote, but also equally disheartened when they notice that despite them working so hard towards these issues, seeing so many others just not care as well. Same people in my generation who feel so powerless and disengaged from the entire process that they feel like there's no point to engage in it at all, because what good would it do? And that is something that at least people my age should be aware of, and understand that even if nothing comes and you don't get the results that you want from this round of elections or this vote or this current action, disengaging from the very process itself makes sure that it would never happen either. So it's an interesting paradox that I'm noticing more and more people becoming savvy to it as well. So
one of the reasons you came, or at least I understood that you wanted to kind of take a break between your master's work and PhD work, and part of the reason you wanted to come to the Meadows Center was to learn more about, I guess, the policy side of things. I haven't asked you this question before, so it'll be interesting to hear your answer. But what have you learned since you've come here on the policy side?
Yeah. Excellent question, by the way. And I sometimes lay awake asking myself that at night as well, in terms of trying to, I don't say that in a bad way, of course, just as I'm definitely a self-reflective person, sometimes detrimentally so. But yes, I was drawn to the Meadows Center in part because of Andy Sampson, who helped found the center and has been someone who I've known since I was young, and he's a longtime fisher up in Lake City, and so through him I was aware of the Meadows Center and the work that's being done here, and he's always been very encouraging and supportive of my career and my path forward in just pursuit of knowledge and education and climate science. And so I wanted to, or I take that back, I emotionally needed to take some distance between myself and school just for a year to kind of reset my mind in some extent and prepare on an emotional and financial level for a PhD. And so it represented, a perfect opportunity, Robert and Carrie, coming to work with you guys. And like I was talking about with education and action, I wanted to try to see the other side of the coin, because it's all, it's well and good to sit in a classroom and talk in academic circles about what is and isn't being done in climate, and what's failing and what the studies and the raw numbers see. But it's another aspect to come and look at how do you actually implement those things? How are the recommendations of scientists and the results of studies actually turned into meaningful action and work? And the Meadows Center does a wonderful job when it comes to water and education and expanding into climate. And it was the perfect place for me to try to experience that, especially in Texas, which is a state that is generally not known for its stellar climate policies. And it's been very eye-opening on some levels, because coming in here, I was assuming it was just because no one wanted to really understand what was happening, or people didn't get the context, or just didn't care. And being able to have our conversations and see the work that's been going on hands on is it's a lot more nuanced than that. Again, look at that. My same answer that I gave for context earlier was thrown right back in my own face. But it's the sort of thing to where understanding that, if you talk to just about, any Texan, they'll at this point tend to agree that, yeah, things have been getting warmer in the previous years and that there are certainly things happening, and some, even outright talk about, yeah, well, the climate's changing, but then it becomes, well, what should we do about it? And that's the question. That was the big opening experience for me, understanding that just acknowledging the issue existing doesn't necessarily give a sense of responsibility to do something about it either. And that was useful for me to, I think, understand, because we all hold our own preconceived biases and notions about what we feel about others, especially with climate change, in the sense of, you can make arguments that, well, such and such country is the most, heavily polluting country at this point in time, so they should be the ones who handle and make the most sacrifices. Or others can say, oh, well, the U.S. has historically been the heaviest emitter of greenhouse gases in history, and so we have a responsibility to do something about it. And it's easy to devolve into finger pointing, even though, at the end of the day, the answer is it affects all of us, and climate change doesn't care about borders or arbitrary measures that humans implement. It is something that affects all of us, and unfortunately, it's also an issue that disproportionately impacts those who are less empowered at the moment to do something about it. So there is a level of responsibility to assist, especially in countries that have historically gotten the opportunity to develop through the use and implementation of greenhouse gases and fossil fuels. So, wow, as you can see, I easily tend to ramble off into separate directions from a thread, but bringing myself back on focus here. In terms of other lessons I've gained from policy at the Meadows Center is that there's a strong delineation between the role of science and researchers in the implementation of policy. The role of a researcher and the researcher's recommendations are not prescriptive. They're descriptive. They describe the situation and what is going on, what is known and unknown, and what actions are most likely to have positive impact and which ones are most likely to have negative impact. It is then where the policymakers pick up the baton and then take that information and turn that into action or inaction themselves. And that's something that when you say it out loud, it seems to innately make a lot of sense. But to me, being very involved in one side wasn't something that was immediately apparent to me. And so, Robert, our conversations that we have been really eye-opening in those regards, and understanding from the experience of trying to it's always a balancing act too between in a system such as ours, there's always someone who will be unhappy with something. And so you try to operate in a way to where you can do the most amount of good while making the most amount of people happy. And that's a very fine line to walk on, and one that, I have absolutely, I'm in the very early stages of even being able to comprehend how I myself can walk in those lines, and getting to see how others navigate and approach it is very important.
I was going to say, I either learned you well or you're too polite to disagree with me on a podcast, but which it's okay. I mean, I in the I guess the generation alphas that I'm talking to and in my class, and then the Gen Zers a few years ago, it's not a popular position of the scientists need to focus on the science and stay out of the policy advocacy business, since it cancels out the science. And I get the angst associated with that, because when the world is literally burning down, you kind of want to do both. But
Yeah.
there's one thing I've learned from working, and it's like I wouldn't have this understanding if I hadn't worked in the policy world and kind of see how policymakers and politicians kind of react to information. I can get it. We're running long. I have one last quick question to ask you. How was Carrie as a boss? And a minute of uncomfortable seat adjusting is an acceptable answer.
Yeah, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Can I just sit quietly? And
Yes, yeah.
Just no. No.
You can just say she was great.
Yeah, it's been great. With both of you, it's been absolutely great. You guys have been welcome. You've welcomed me with open arms. And if I wasn't so committed on returning to my mountain trees, I would be seriously considering staying. But unfortunately, the forest calls. But
yes, well, that's not unfortunate, and the forest is calling you, and so you should definitely answer that call.
Yeah, and your indirect response is noted, Nick, and will come up in your review.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to it.
Well, those of you who are listening, you can, I have the joy. We have, Nick and I have a standing kind of 2-hour lunch date every week to talk about climate change and policy and stuff like that. So, and it's always really enjoyable, and I always have to keep an eye on the clock, because time will just go by like it has with this conversation. And so I think you've proven to everybody all those nice things I said about you. You've demonstrated all of those in spades. So thank you so much for agreeing to visit with us and share your perspectives. Very, very much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you again both for having me on, and it's been an absolute blast to just get an opportunity to talk on record.
And when you get done with your degree, look us up.
Yeah.
Will do.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you both much.
Bye. All right. Tell me some good news, Robert.
There was a report put out, a joint report. University of Texas at Austin, Vibrant Clean Energy, and University of Colorado Boulder, called Don't Mess with Texas, Getting the Lone Star State to Net Zero by 2050. And number of folks on this. Isabella Gee is the lead author on that, and maybe we should see if we can get her on.
That'd be great.
And the ever-present Michael Weber was also involved in that. But it's an analysis, and we were talking earlier as I was, on my very tall soapbox, talking about role of scientists. It's a it's an option analysis of what Texas can do to reach a net zero situation by 2050, and they look at a number of different approaches, like using hydrogen or electric for transportation, building efficiency, on-site solar. Things that could happen in the industrial side, including different fuels and carbon management, like sequestration that we've talked about earlier, as well as agriculture. And then that's a big topic because, farming can, farming can be a source of Carrie's favorite topic, methane. But farming and agriculture and ranching can also be a sink for carbon, and carbon credits are actually a kind of a big topic in land conservation circles in general, but also particularly in Texas. And so the good news there is, besides this report existing, is that they believe that there are different ways these options can be put together. There's multiple pathways to get to a net zero Texas by 2050.
Nice.
So then it's up to the legislature, or individuals or companies or non-governmental organizations, which I think are a major driver right now in Texas, to get things done to get to a net zero situation. So that's my good news.
Nice. Well, it ties in well with mine because that's sort of at the systemic level, and this one's a little bit more at home, what you can do at home. Along the same lines, though, just kind of referencing this last IPCC report that scientists do believe it's possible we can get our emissions cut in half by 2030. And part of that is through the changes we make at home. So this article is really highlighting 4 different ways that you can go electric, and that will make a big difference. And I picked it, Robert, because our coworker Charla this week was making a pitch for gas-fired cooking, and Robert and I both were like, "Uh-oh, you're going to have to say goodbye to that because it's much more sustainable to switch to electric," and that's the case they're making here anyway. So. Highlighting when you can to choose low carbon sources of electricity. Like in our city in Austin, you can actually choose wind energy and solar energy, and make sure that everything you're using in your house is coming from a zero carbon source. So you have some places you have that choice. They're saying that heating and cooling your house is the biggest culprit, and so where you can switch to get off of your gas-powered furnace and switch to a heat pump would be a big impact if everybody were able to do that. And then they talk about cooking with electricity, but the new sort of preference for cooks, for people that actually care about cooking, because I think that's been one of the holdouts. People don't like electric stoves because they're not as
take a while to heat up, and
they're not as even, and you don't have as much control. And so this what do they call it, conduction?
Mm-hmm.
Conduction cooking. Induction. Yeah, I love this because the cooktops are called hobs. I thought you'd like that.
Yeah, that's a European thing. They call cooktops hobs.
Hobs, yeah. Hobs. No more burners, you have hobs. And so that's enough reason for me to want to change right there. But it uses a magnet instead of the kind of energy we're used to. So the cooking's a lot.
And one thing that's cool about those is that, like, you can have a frying pan on it and be cooking bacon and eggs and pull it off the quote unquote burner or the hob. And put your hand right on it, and there's no heat or anything.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know what happens if you have a pacemaker. Maybe don't. Maybe you need to get an exemption, but
yeah, you probably don't want to put your heart up on there.
Yeah. And then the last bit was, you might be interested or know something about this, Robert, but the move towards electric vehicles, EVs, there's a real move to use bidirectional charging, and so that our cars could not only be powered by electricity, but they could actually provide electricity in the case of a blackout, or the problems that we're more increasingly having with our power grid. We could actually all have a built-in generator in our driveway, and so a lot of models are starting to think about how we can use electric vehicles in different ways to kind of support our lifestyle. So that was kind of cool.
I don't know if this is true or not, but I think the Ford electric F-150 has that capability.
Nice.
And I should note that it costs less than a gas-powered Ford F-150,
and has way more torque and power, right? From what I've heard.
Yeah. Might not be for everybody, it's but
But Ford, if you want to donate one to the Meadows Center,
We'll take it.
happy to
Yeah.
provide our email address.
We'll provide a good review. Yeah, we could use an electric pickup truck. One thing, and I'm sure there's someone out there is probably judging me right now, going, dude, you're talking about climate change, and you flew to Iceland and back, and Carrie, this kind of relates to like how do Icelanders think about climate change? Well, when we bought our tickets, we had the option to pay a little more to offset our carbon on the trip, and so we did that. That money is going to go towards reforestation in Iceland, which will be a carbon sink. The Vikings, like they tore all the tree, they cut all the trees down in order to boil seawater for salt. And then they pretty much deforested the entire island. And so there's not very many trees there, but there's a lot more now than there were 20 years ago. And then the car that we rented, it was an internal combustion engine. But the same thing, when I rented the car, I could click a box, which I did, that I paid more to offset the carbon. And so, I had a New Year's resolution the year of COVID that I was going to carbon offset all of my flights. It became easy to meet that because nobody was going anywhere. But but that was kind of a cool thing to see.
Yeah, I rented a car recently and I noticed that option.
Did it have that as well? That's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
It's usually just a few dollars too, so why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, always a pleasure saving the world with you, Robert.
Well, likewise. This was a long episode.
I know. Why does there have to be so much? I'm just kidding.
Well, thanks again, Carrie. And we'll see you all. Stay cool, stay warm, or stay vigilant. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
But